Minutes past. John, if you want to kick us off, we can just get going.
Sure, happy to.
We've got, actually, first though, we should introduce Jen Hoyt, who's giving our presentation today on the updated fire code. So she will be starting the presentation after John gives his update. Again, welcome to Jen.
Okay. So I'll just jump in and try to go through this as quickly as possible to give the most amount of time to Jen. I'll start on the legislative side of the equation. Start with last week. Massachusetts saw its bond rating increase to AAA plus and unemployment drop to 3.5%. Standard & Poor's attributed the bond rating improvement to the state's strong economy and commitment to better budget management practices. Excuse me. The state added, the state added 16,300 jobs in March, with the leisure and hospitality industry leading the growth. MBTA, the state's transit agency, is set to add 964 more jobs and will fill over 2,000 vacancies, with the governor allocating $20 million for worker recruitment. Meanwhile, the Federal Transit Agency demanded immediate action to address safety concerns after 5 near misses between trains and workers on subway tracks in the last 5 weeks, or in 5 weeks, sorry. A new poll revealed that Massachusetts residents support sending more funds to the 15 regional transit authorities across the state, with 74% preferring the funds come from a new surtax on millionaire households. In the housing sector, Boston seeks to revive rent control, with a bill currently awaiting for the housing. House leaders aim to introduce the state lottery to digital platforms, with iLottery directing $200 million in new revenue toward education and care grants. However, trade groups and the Mass Municipal Association expressed concern over how this would affect sales and local revenues. This week, on Monday, the Massachusetts House returned to the State House to discuss House Ways and Means $56.2 billion state budget for FY24. Over 75% of the 1,566 amendments filed are earmarks, the highest count in more than a decade. Most amendments will not be publicly introduced or voted on individually, as House leaders typically consolidate amendments into bundles. The Democrats supported a proposal to exempt an estimated $1 billion in the new fair share surtax revenue from the annual state tax collection cap, thus avoiding, if it passes, avoiding the Chapter 62F rebates that we all received last year if the state collects too much in revenue. Throughout Monday, lawmakers privately discussed amendments, which were later consolidated into mega amendments. 2 such amendments totaling $53.5 million were adopted, covering categories like education, local aid, social services, veteran services, health and human services, and elder affairs. The amendments included funding increases for various programs such as METCO, special education, and a permanent universal school meals program. Further amendment discussions for public safety, judiciary, public health, mental health, and disability service categories are scheduled for the coming days. Senate Democrats will meet privately to discuss their state budget proposal, but the exact topics remain unclear. Governor Healy will be attending several industry events next week or this week, including the Massachusetts Biotech Council Summit and the National Association of Corporate Directors and the New England Chapter Gala. So pretty much on the legislative side of the equation, it's budget. Some hearings are beginning, but it's mainly everyone is focused on budget at the moment. So that is the the legislative side of the equation. So I'll just stop there quickly to ask if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll jump over to the regulatory side of the equation. Okay, don't see any questions. So on the regulatory side, there are a bunch of board meetings today, tomorrow, and throughout May. Today is the Commonwealth's Designer Selection Board meeting. Tomorrow, there's 2 meetings that are sub-meetings or subcommittees of BFPR. So there's the Administrative Code Committee and the Electrical Code Interpretation Committee. Those are both tomorrow. May 3rd is the Elevator Board. May 8th is the Architectural Access Board. The 9th is the BBRS. The 10th is the Designer Selection Board again. The 16th will be the Elevator Board. The 17th, Sheet Metals. The 22nd will be the Architectural Access again. The 22nd also will be the Electricians. The 24th will be another Designer Selection Board, and on May 30th will be the Board of Elevator Regulations. All these meetings, the dates for these meetings and the details of these meetings can all be found on the AI Massachusetts website on the regulatory calendar. In terms of new regulations over the last month, there's been no new regulations, but a whole slew of notice of corrections. Back on March 3rd, their state sanitary code did a notice of corrections for the CMR 105 chapter 700, dealing with the implementation of Mass General Law chapter 94C. The 310 CMR, these are the DEP regulations. On March 17th, there was a notice of correction on the air pollution control regulations. That's the CMR 310 chapter 7. Also on the 17th, there was a notice of corrections related to the Massachusetts Water Resource Management Program. That's CMR 310 chapter 36. On the BFPR side, on March 17th, and Jen will probably get to maybe some of this, although this is electrical code, not fire code. On March 17th, there was a notice of amendments, notice corrections went out for the CMR 527 chapter 12. And on the 31st, there was another notice of corrections that also went out for the 527 chapter 12, CMR 527 chapter 12. Again, these are both Massachusetts electrical code amendments. In terms of the BBRS, the last meeting was on April 11th, and the following was discussed mainly. There was a proposal that was put forward by Tara Gillespie and myself. This was a proposal related to the various, how to hold public hearings and what the board may want to do in terms of how to handle comments and how to handle the actual formal process of the public hearings. The board counsel, Charles Kilb, suggested that the board focus on the number of meetings and how to handle the comment period. And ultimately, the board agreed to hold one in-person meeting in Boston, one in-person meeting in Springfield, one virtual meeting, all 3 during normal business hours. The exact dates of the hearings are to be determined once the 10th edition proposal has been approved by the Healy administration, but the board did agree to hold one meeting per week for 3 weeks, with public comment submissions closing 1 week after the last hearing. So again, we don't know what the date of the hearings will be. We won't know that until the BBRS gets clearance from the Healy administration to move to the public hearing. But once there are public hearings, there will be 3 of them, one a week over a 3-week period. Lastly, is the Architectural Registration Board met on April 11th. They discussed a few different items. One was elections to the board. So Holly Kratzley, who is the current chair of the board, will be stepping down and is not looking to be reappointed. Elon Tierney, who was the vice chair, has now stepped up to become the chair. Squeezy Sam was voted in as the vice chair, and Chan Pisa was voted in as secretary. The board gave final approval to the Joint Engineers Architects Practice Guide. So the Division of Licensure will be printing that soon and making that available for all. And that's just a update of an existing guide that's been out there for 10 or 15 years now. Again, that's the Joint Engineering Architect Practice Guide. The board started reviewing feedback on the draft FAQ questions related to continuing education credits. The board discussed a variety of questions and proposed responses, and the board council is going to review those comments and incorporate them into a new draft for further review by the board. That really is it in terms of the regulatory updates. I'll stop there again, and if there's any questions, put them forward. This is in written format. I will send it to Megan and Josh so they can distribute it to you all as you see fit. And it will also, if you need more information, if you go to the AIA Massachusetts website, go to the Government Affairs Committee page, you can find legislative updates there also.
John, I have a question about the Architectural Access Board.
Go ahead, Chris.
They have draft regulations, draft revisions on their website dating from 2018. Do you know what the status of that is?
I wasn't aware that they had draft regulations up there. I know that probably somewhere around 2018 was the last time that the registration board with a previous group of board members was looking to make some changes. And they did make some changes to the section 2 and 3, but no changes to section 4. Section 4 was the big, it really is the big meat of the regulations. It's the portion that really deals with practice. The other two deal with being on the path to becoming a licensed architect and the educational requirements to sit for the exam. And it was section 4 that caused the most concern. You might remember this, the big concern was around signing of contracts. That's clear that only an architect can sign a contract for architectural services. That didn't change, but there was a lot of pushback from the engineering community on that. But long and short, there were no changes. Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm talking about the Architectural Access Board, not the registration.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said registration board. My apologies.
No,
the architecture. I'm not sure about the Architectural Access Board. I know that they have been trying to make changes, but at least under the previous administration, and I'm not sure what the Healy administration thinks about this, under the previous administration, there was reluctance by the Baker administration to move forward on any of the proposed MAB regulations until the MAB decided to move into a national code, meaning moving to ICC and adopting Chapter 11. I think what the board likely did is they decided to wait out to see, when the Baker administration would finally leave, a new administration would come in with the hope that a new administration would have a different take. So I'm not really sure what's happening on that. I'm going to have to attend an MAB meeting and see how things are shaking out there. But in the meantime, draft regulations are just that, they're draft. And until they become approved, they are to a certain extent meaningless. The only thing that's actually in effect are the approved regulations. So I would hold firm on what the regulations stand or where they stand today, comply with them as they require, and we'll certainly check in to see what's happening with the MAB now until we have a new administration in place.
Thank you.
Yep. Jen, with your former hat on, do you know anything about MAB and what they may have been up to?
No, I think because of some of the changes that happened at the board level, things that had been kind of moving forward kind of came to a stop and have just been a bit stagnant. I haven't heard of any movement forward, and I'm not sure what the timeline is on that. I know that there's a desire to try to have amendments, but there's been a desire to have amendments to that code since I started in the industry. So you know, I'm not really sure how close we are to actually seeing it being published.
Yeah, I agree. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, I bring it up only because I was in front of them 2 months ago on a variance, and they offered a ruling based on the draft regulations.
They overruled
variance based on the the previously approved draft regulations, and I was trying to figure out whether they're actually moving forward with them or not.
We should talk offline, because if they are approving variances based on draft regulations, and if that draft regulation happens to be in conflict with what the current regulations are, that is something we should know about, because that's not something that the board can or should be doing. They can only enforce the regulations that are actually in effect. They can't enforce draft regulations. So we should talk offline a little bit about that.
Sure.
I'll give you a call either later today or tomorrow, so we can get a little more detail about it. That's all right with you?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Josh. And again, I'll email you the update.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we'll get it so that the BSA can distribute it to everybody that's on this email list.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks again, John. Jen, can we see if you can share your screen? Great. So we welcome Jen. We introduced her earlier. Jen is currently with Code Red Consultant. She spent quite a few years also with fire services, and we look forward to your presentation. With that, I'll let you go. If you have questions to the rest of the group, as always, you're welcome to put them into the chat, and we will talk through them at the end with Jen. Also, I think there'll probably be some opportunities if you want to ask questions directly verbally at the end. You can do that as well, but please don't interrupt her during her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. So just a little bit of background on me. I saw some familiar names in the participant list, but I'm a fire protection engineer. I've been in the industry since 2008, which seems like a long time when I think about it now. And I started out as a code consultant working for a firm in Boston, and then transitioned over to a smaller company that does fire alarm sprinkler design for government buildings. So it's kind of the other side of fire protection engineering. And then I went to the State Fire Marshal's office, and I was there for about 8.5 years. And I recently just started with Code Red Consultants in January. So I have a pretty good background on the Massachusetts Comprehensive Fire Safety Code. It was being discussed when I first started there in 2014. It was kind of in its last stages, and then it was published in 2015. So I've been part of the technical advisors to that code since its changeover to NFPA 1 format. So hopefully that lends me a little bit of insight. All right, just a little bit about Code Red Consultants and what we do and where we kind of land within this building industry. So we have multiple groups of people. We do code consulting, which is what everybody kind of recognizes and usually will deal with. We do some design of fire and sprinkler systems, fire alarm systems on specific projects. We also kind of look at some special systems and like fire pumps and smoke control systems. And then we also do construction phase services, which is once the building has a permit and is under construction, we deal with construction fire safety, commissioning and integrated testing of systems, and anything that kind of goes with that. So we will follow a building from its initial conception all the way through to the certificate of occupancy. And sometimes beyond that, if there's additional smoke control testing required every 6 months or whatever. So We do have a lot of people in the office that have been integrated into the process, that use the building codes and the fire codes all the way through and have experience in all different areas. So these are the objectives that we have for this training. We're going to kind of go through the highlights of the new version of the Comprehensive Fire Safety Code, which was first published in December of 2022, and then there were some amendments that were added on. So the most recent version of it is February 3rd, and a lot of those amendments didn't change the content. It edited some errors in the publishing. So we're going to talk about some of the changes to the code and some of the new standards, focusing on energy storage systems, which is finally an actual published acceptable standard, so we can enforce it in Massachusetts, which is really nice. And then I'm gonna highlight some things that aren't necessarily new, but are good for designers and architects to consider when you're approached with a new or existing construction building. There's some things in the fire code that I don't think architects and designers typically know to look for. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about some design coordination items. Safeguarding during construction is something that's going to be much more widely enforced at the beginning of the project. And also fire department vehicle access is usually one of the first things that's considered by the AHJ. So just looking at what the code is we adopted the 2021 version of NFPA 1. The process is pretty open. All of the meetings are open meetings. There's discussion on every single chapter of the code. Typically, the board will look at, in this version, we went from the 2015 edition of NFPA 1 to 2021. So the board took a look at all of the changes between 2015 and 2018 and considered whether they wanted to use those or not, and if they could get rid of amendments. And then they looked at the changes from 2018 to 2021 and then did the same process. NFPA documents are fairly easy to use. They're searchable, so you can go online. They're free to view, and you can type in whatever topic you're looking for into the search function, and it should pull up all the different sections that that's in. There's also an index in the back where you can go and look at whatever you're looking for, and it'll tell you the code sections where that's mentioned. And so it's a relatively user-friendly code. That's the intent. I think the more that you use an NFPA document, the more familiar you are. Typically, the beginning chapters are administrative. So 1 tells you about the jurisdiction. 2 are your reference standards. So it tells you the addition of NFPA 13 and NFPA 72. And then 3 is your definitions. And beyond that, the standards kind of go from general requirements in 4, 5, 6, and then usually have more specific requirements on the tail end of the code. So you kind of have to go through all of the code, make sure that you're picking up those general requirements that apply to all different types of buildings and occupancies, and then move forward into the more specific types of occupancies. So Massachusetts deleted a bunch of chapters, and we modified some chapters. Most of that is due to the way that our statutory requirements are in Massachusetts, that the fire code cannot regulate something that's regulated in the building code or other codes. So we do have a little bit of crossover from the base NFPA document to the building code, to the DEP regulations. When you talk about open burning, it's a little bit with the plumbing and fuel gas code. When you talk about piping of systems and some of that. So there are some sections that are in NFPA 1 that aren't enforceable because it's in another code. And a lot of times what NFPA 1 does, what the fire code does, is it is used for maintenance. So if fire department comes through a building for whatever reason and they see a hallway that's completely blocked with cardboard boxes and chairs, they know, because it's in their code, that there's supposed to be an open hallway, and they can notify the building official, but they also have the enforcement ability to enforce that hallway to be cleared. even though the means of egress and all of those requirements for clear width are in the building code. So it does kind of work hand in hand, and the goal is to have the enforcement agents work together within a community. So when you pick up the code, what you have right now available on the State House bookstore is NFPA 1 as a standalone document and a package that's not very thick of fire prevention regulations that are statewide. Together, those create one code. And it is a little bit difficult to kind of read it piecemeal because it does say a section and delete exception 2. So you have to actually look up the section, look at exception 2, and then not use it. The goal is to have a combined version of NFPA 1 with Massachusetts amendments. The state has been working with NFPA, and they are currently to try to figure out the copyright issues of doing that. But NFPA does publish codes with other states that have those requirements incorporated. So when that's done, it should be a really nice document because all the deleted, stricken language that has a line through it is just going to be gone. So it'll be much easier to read. But if you're looking for any of the codes, you can go to the Massachusetts State Bookstore and you can buy one. I think it's $20, $25. You can also go to mass.gov/DFS or mass.gov, and in the search bar, type Massachusetts Fire Code, and it'll pop up with the DFS website, and there's an unofficial version of the code. The unofficial version of the code is what was sent to the Secretary of State's bookstore. So you can look at it for free, but just if you wanted a full legal version that will hold up in court, what's published by the state bookstore is that version. For any NFPA codes, you can go to www.nfpa.org/whatever the code number is. So for 1, you put a 1 on the end. For 855, you put 855. And you have the option to view the code. Just make sure that it's the right version that we're using in Massachusetts. But that is free and that is searchable. And it's a really convenient feature. So the Board of Fire Prevention Regulations, I mentioned how it's an open code review process. There are 7 committees, and the way that the NFPA code is laid out allows us to piecemeal all of the committees by chapters. So the administrative sections are 1 through 9. General requirements are 10 through 19. So you have your site access, you have some general requirements, some decorative materials in there. Occupancy are chapters 20 through 39. So if you have a specific occupancy, like schools or cannabis facilities, anything that's a use of a building, it's going to be in there. And then processes are 40 through 49. So you have hot work, the creation of combustible dust, different kinds of things like that. And then equipment is 50 through 59. So you have cooking hoods used for cooking exhaust, ovens and furnaces, kilns, that kind of thing are in the equipment section. And then hazardous materials, nobody really wants to go into that, so they stick it at the very back of the book because it gets really technical. But that's all chapters 60 through 75. And typically chapter 60 is where you find all of the general requirements, and then the rest of the chapters dive down into the type of hazardous material that you have. I'm going to get into those specifics a little bit. I know that as architects, you don't dive into the fire code as much as fire protection engineers might, or even probably fire protection engineers in most cases don't dive into the code that much. But I do have all the sections in the presentation so that you at least see it. So if something comes up on a project, you can just be, oh, I remember that was a title of a chapter in the fire code, and at least you have an idea that there might be some regulations. We call it the Model Fire Code because it's based off of the Model Code of NFPA 1. There's always a lot of opinions on whether or not the state should have gone with NFPA 1 versus the IFC. There's a bunch of technical committees incorporated in the NFPA codes, and because there are so many different NFPA standards, there's the opportunity to get really technical. They're updated every 3 years, and it's it covers a vast majority of input from industry and different stakeholders. So it was determined that that was the best code to go with. Building code references NFPA standards anyways, so instead of going another step through the IFC, we had decided to just go straight to NFPA. So just kind of how to use the code. There are a couple important terms, and this kind of carries through in the building code as well. Shall is a mandatory requirement. It's a really nice way of saying you must do this. Should is a recommendation, which is advised but not required. I think there may be 3 to 5 references of should in the fire code. Most of it is shall. Shall be permitted means that it can't be prohibited. It's an option for meeting the requirement. So typically there's a requirement, and then there's a secondary code section, and it says a compliance alternative shall be permitted, and it spells out exactly what that is. But we do have a lot of Massachusetts amendments, because Massachusetts is special. It happens with the building code too. A lot of the codes that are unamended, that are used by other states and communities, typically go more west, when the development of those cities and towns were a bit more new. The streets are straight and you have nice little grid system cities. A lot of the infrastructure is a bit more new. In Massachusetts, we have very old infrastructure, historic buildings, weird tiny little one-way streets, a lot of different types of buildings that have spanned a very long time frame. So there's a lot of Massachusetts specific concerns that don't necessarily apply to other parts of the state. And using a national or international code standard, sometimes if there's a regional specific requirement, it won't get put into the national code. So there's some stuff with the specific climate that we might have. And it goes the same way if you're in Florida and it's incredibly hot and there's something that is associated with that, that might not be put in the national code either. So there is reasons why we have Massachusetts specific amendments. We also have to stay within the constraints of the law. So there's, like I said, there's some things that can't be regulated in the fire code because it's regulated somewhere else. We also try to ease into the transition. So when the Model Fire Code was first adopted, if the topic in NFPA 1 was not addressed in the old 527 CMR chapters, it was not addressed in NFPA 1. We deleted it. As time has moved forward, we feel now that we can start thinking about some of those chapters, and you'll see some of them have been added into the code where it's appropriate, but we've tried to make the transition as easy as possible. I will apologize. I made the mistake of going for a run yesterday, and apparently my allergies are at full force today. So talking about law versus regulation, they typically are enforced the same way. The law provides the authority for the board to make the regulations. Typically, laws are more broad, far-reaching than regulations, which tend to get more specific. The board promulgates the regulations, which allows for quicker changes. It's very hard. It takes a long time to change a law or to get a law in place. I'm sure that you've listened to John give his legislative updates for a long time. It's a very long process. Regulations are a relatively short process when you're comparing it to that. And it's easier to make quick changes that are going to be effective for the community. And by quick, I mean like a year or two. They typically have the same effect as the law. There's failure to comply can result in penalties, and it can be civil or criminal. Typically, we try to avoid that, but if there's a provision in the code that's serious, that isn't being complied with, there are opportunities to write a notice of violation follow up within 30 days, and then take it to court if it's still not being complied with. So the scope of the fire safety code typically deals with fire. That's kind of obvious, but I guess if you can, anything outside of a building falls under the fire code, and anything that seems very hazardous or is, you're worried about the fire concerns of it, it's probably handled in the fire safety code. So regulate gunpowder, dynamite, fireworks, flammable fluids, lots of different kinds of hazardous materials, chemicals that can ignite or explode. And then we also include the requirements of the location and materials and construction of buildings to be used for any of those reasons. So if you have a fireworks manufacturing facility, those requirements are in the fire code rather than the building code, because it's just a bit of a special hazard. So the fire code has a little bit more opportunity to deal with those technical aspects. So some of the differences between 527 CMR and NFPA 1, all of Chapter 1 has been replaced by Massachusetts. Like I said, that's the administrative chapter that kind of lays out the jurisdiction and what the AHJs can do through the fire code, what might be under the building code, pull in references to other codes that are used throughout the state. All of the permitting and licensing requirements are in Chapter 1. One-stop locations find everything that you could need to figure out about the permits that are through the fire department. There's the table of note going to be the quantities for hazardous materials. It's table 112.850, and it lists whether or not you need a permit through the fire department, which is your local fire department, or a license, which is through the town. So usually high quantities of materials will require a license. So if you have some type of manufacturing building typically that has large quantities of hazardous chemicals located on site, that site needs a license through the town, through the Board of Selectmen or whatever the structure is, in order to have that amount of chemicals on site. Also, Chapter 1 outlines the SPR appeals process. So I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But that's something that was brought into the NFPA 1 series of codes that wasn't in the 527 CMR chapters before 2015. So it's nice that there is an appeals process that's laid out very clearly. Chapter 2 are our reference publications. So if you're looking for what version of some random standard might be referenced in the fire code, it's in Chapter 2. All of the reference documents are listed as whole codes, and then where there are only citations to certain sections of codes, that's a separate section. So you can go and see exactly what part of a code might have been adopted, and the rest of it wouldn't have been adopted in Massachusetts. There's kind of a hierarchy because the fire code is Massachusetts specific, where requirements of a reference document differs from the Massachusetts code, the Massachusetts code will prevail. That's the one that applies. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes there's more specific requirements, typically Massachusetts amendments, that are going to supersede some of those standards. We did change a couple editions of some of the reference standards. So check the amendment package just to see. It's a small list. Only one NFPA standard we changed is 241, which is construction safeguarding. And instead of adopting the 2018 version, which is part of NFPA 1 2021, we adopted the newest one that was published, which is 2022. So Chapter 3 has definitions. We kept the NFPA definitions with some exceptions and additions. There's a couple definitions that we changed to align with the building code so that it's pretty similar anyways, but we just tweaked it so that it is the same. There is one definition of note, which is authority having jurisdiction. This is base language, and it's very open-ended. It means an organization, office, or individual responsible for enforcing the requirements of a code or standard. And so AHJ could be the building official, if it's a building element, could be the fire official, if it's a fire element, it could be the forest warden, if it's an open burning requirement. In most cases, the AHJ is going to be the fire official, because we're in the fire code. But just be aware that if it seems like the requirement could cross over to building code, it might actually be under the building code, and the building official has authority to enforce it, but the fire official has the authority to require its maintenance. A good example of that would be a control area wall, a rated wall around hazardous materials. The building code is going to tell you that you need that, and it's going to tell you that you need 1 or 2 hours. It's going to tell you the construction requirements of that, and the building official enforces it. Unfortunately, once a certificate of occupancy is issued, the building official doesn't have as many opportunities to go into that building as a fire official might. So if there's a big hole punched in the wall and the fire official sees it, they have the maintenance requirement. So they can say this wall's not being maintained to 1 or 2 hours, whatever it was built to, and it needs to be maintained. How that's done goes through the building official because it's a wall. It's a little bit confusing, but hopefully the local jurisdiction typically works together, and we try to have fire officials and building officials work together on violation notices like that, so that you get both references to the codes. So going through the code itself, chapters 4 through 10 are the general requirement section. We deleted chapter 4. It essentially just had objectives for the code. Basically, keep your hallways clean, you know, maintain free egress, don't store large quantities of hazardous materials, all of these kind of broad requirements that were being cited by fire officials, but weren't specific to the code. Everything that's in chapter 4 is dealt with in a more specific way in the rest of the fire code. So we just deleted it because there was really no purpose to it. Chapter 5 is performance-based option. You always have the opportunity to do a performance-based design. There's a basis for the design with like different fire scenarios that need to be run through the model or taken into consideration. And it kind of lays out how that performance-based design is evaluated and tested. Chapter 6 is called, it's the occupancy chapter, and that's completely deleted because we deal with occupancy through the building code. So there is a little bit of a definition difference. Assembly space is, we use the word assembly in NFPA 1, but we use A1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 through the building code. So you can kind of use your best judgment. It's relatively the same language, but we just kind of deleted chapter 6 because the fire code doesn't have the authority to determine occupancy. Chapters 7, 8, and 9 are reserved, which is done by NFPA 1, and it typically just maintains the numbering so that it lines up with other NFPA standards. Chapter 10 has your general requirements, and this is where Massachusetts dumps all of their weird, random requirements that don't fit anywhere else. We have a section on fire drills, which there's a Massachusetts statute on the number of fire drills, the frequency in schools. So that's kind of pulled into that section. We have all the requirements for emergency action plans for all different types of occupancies in there. Open flames, grills, fire protection markings, like if a building is derelict and it's not occupied anymore, the way that the building is closed up and secured so that it's not a target for arson, and the way that it's marked from the outside to let firefighters know that it's a dangerous building with the big red X. That's all laid out very clearly. I think they're FEMA guidelines. And then we talked about seasonal buildings, which is kind of a interesting topic that's not really handled in the building code so much, and combustible vegetation. So it has a lot of requirements that span different occupancies, and are just kind of general requirements. Chapters 11 through 15 are more building services requirements. So Chapter 11 is called building services. It talks about oil burners. If you have any kind of pressure vessels, oil burner systems, has the requirements for photovoltaic systems. We can take questions on this at the end because I know that it's definitely a hot topic right now. It says exactly the same thing as the International Fire Code, the IFC. It has all the setbacks that are in the base code for IFC. We didn't amend anything. We just didn't delete it because at some point the building code sends you to the fire code. So you have to have something there in order to close that gap. So it is referenced by the 10th edition for setbacks right now. And like I said, we can take questions at the end. Chapter 12 is features of fire protection. So that kind of deals with some of your interior finishes. The building code handles the more permanent finishes like walls, floors, ceilings, things that aren't going to move. The fire code deals with the less permanent provisions. So decorations, draperies, curtains. I've gone in there for like a haunted house in Salem, and they made their own monsters out of paper mache with all this paint and things hanging off of them. And all of those needed to be tested to a flame spread criteria. And they ended up just adding a flame retardant spray on everything. But those requirements are all in Chapter 12 for anything that can be kind of moved around a building. We also have requirements for upholstered seating and mattresses. So the mattresses definitely applies to hospitals and detention facilities. Typically, those mattresses are spec'd out when the building is being renovated or the mattresses are being purchased. And then upholstered seating is typically applicable to most public areas. It doesn't apply to a lot of residential spaces, but assembly spaces, offices, things like that, the upholstered seating requirements are there. And I think you're probably familiar with it. It's like Cal 117 or Cal 133, which is the same thing as what is referenced with the ASTM standards. But that's where you find that. It's in Chapter 12. Chapter 13 is fire protection systems. Most of it is covered under the building code. In buildings that are pre-1975 that haven't been substantially renovated, that's before the building code was published. There are requirements for smoke alarms in 1- and 2-family homes and even beyond that into multi-unit dwellings. And those requirements are laid out because of a statute that the fire code has the ability to deal with everything before 1975, and everything after 1975 should comply with the building code because that's when it was published. 14 is means of egress. A lot of it is not enforceable for design through the fire code. But like I said, if the fire official goes through a building and notices that all of the doors are being held open with the fire extinguishers, or hallways are blocked, hallways are always blocked, they can go and say, this hallway needs to be clear. When it gets down to what that clearance is and the required width and the capacity of the means of egress, that falls under the building code. So the building and fire officials should be working together. But the fact that it needs to be maintained does fall under the fire code. Chapter 16 is the essentially the 2022 edition of NFPA 241. It looks in the code like a complete new amendment. What was in Chapter 16 before were references to the 2019 NFPA 241, and the code was reworked. A lot of section numbers changed. A lot of the information is very similar, but the organization of the standard itself changed. So Massachusetts has a completely new Chapter 16 to pull in all the right reference numbers. It is a hot topic, no pun intended, in Massachusetts right now. There have been a lot of construction fires and a lot of major construction fires that have reached national news. If you're familiar with the fire in Waltham, that was a really big one, and it came on the heels of a massive fire in Cambridge that spanned multiple blocks and cost a lot of money and damage. Both of those buildings were under construction at different stages, and so that kind of spurred Massachusetts leading the charge of construction fire safety. So that's part of the reason why we adopted the 2022 NFPA 1, to try to be on the cutting edge of that. And because the requirements in the 2022 are based off of lessons learned between the last version of the code and the newest one. So rather than being a step behind and knowing it, we tried to stay up with the most recent applicable safety standards. It applies to all new construction, alterations, additions, and demolition. The way that 241 kind of applies is it's scaled. If you have a small renovation, you have a small fire safety plan, and you might, if you're doing like a tenant fit out in a multi-story building, you have a safety plan for what is going on with the construction within that tenant space and how that interacts with the egress and the safety for the rest of the tenants in the building. Might be a couple pages, might kind of just outline some of the concerns, how people are going to be occupying the space, if the sprinklers are going to be turned off, the fire alarm system is going to be impaired for any amount of time, and how to safeguard against anything happening during those impaired times. When you have a large, high-rise, tall wood building, which is now allowed in the building code in the 10th edition, your fire safety plan is large and it's scaled up. Because there's a lot of combustibles on site, the fire safety plan requires more insight into what that hazard looks like and what's the best way to mitigate those risks. So it is very fluid and open-ended, but just know that because it is such an important topic in Massachusetts, there's a lot of training going out on safeguarding during construction to fire officials, and the reference in the building code goes directly to the fire code, so it will come up on a lot of projects, maybe more often than it has in the past, because of the level of training that's going out from the state on this specific topic. Typically, you need to have your construction safeguarding fire safety plan in place when a permit is pulled, and it can change over the course of time as the building progresses, as it becomes the structure is encased in gypsum, as the stairs are putting in, the safety hazards diminish because you have more access and less flammability. But making sure that that plan is discussed during the design phase is important, because there's ways to phase construction to think about improving safety in the building, especially with the systems that are put in, like sprinklers and fire alarm systems, that can really help a project move forward and provide more opportunities for consecutive construction to go on if those systems are planned out in the beginning. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. Chapters 17 through 25 and 27. Chapter 18 is fire department access and water supply. About that in a minute. There is a section on combustible waste and refuse, which typically comes into play for construction of buildings, but also talks about trash chutes and access to those. There's some requirements in the building code that go to an NFPA standard, and some of that NFPA standard is extracted into Chapter 19 of NFPA 1. So it's all kind of the same thing, but there's just there. Occupancy fire safety. There's some Massachusetts specific requirements, kind of outlines what buildings need to have. A lot of this is handled in the building code itself, but there's a couple things that are more movable or hazardous, say this hallway, that are handled in the fire code. And I bolded both of those because those are probably the most common ones within these sections that people would use. There's also automobile wrecking yards, clean rooms, and dry cleaning. Clean rooms and dry cleaning typically just adopt the NFPA standards that handle those. Not a lot of requirements specific in Massachusetts to those. So, fire department access and water supply. All new buildings and additions to new buildings need to at least assess their fire department access and the water supply that's available associated with that access. Fire department vehicles, the apparatus needs to have access to within 250 feet of a perimeter of a sprinklered building. It's less if the building's not sprinklered, but essentially if a ladder truck can get to partway up the outside of the building and the crew can get off with a hose and walk around to 250 feet, and another engine company comes up the other side of the building and they can get off with a hose and go to 250 feet, then your building meets the requirements. What's important to note that access has to be realistic. I've had projects where the building is right up against a railroad and there's a large fence, a high fence between the railroad and the property. So you could kind of get through there, but based on how close it was to the building, you really don't have room to do any kind of fire department operations. Like throw ladders against the building, or I've had other instances where the grade on the back of the building is so steep that you really can't get firefighters into the back of the building and do any kind of operation because it's really hard to walk on a grade that might be that steep. So it's important to kind of think about the layout of the building within a site and have these conversations with the fire department early on in the planning stage. We see a lot of these conversations come up when a special permit is pulled through a town. A lot of times the fire department will look at the apparatus access at that point. It's always best to have apparatus access all the way around the building, but sometimes it's just not feasible. The fire department will provide you the specifications for their largest responding vehicle, whether that's through their own town or a mutual aid town, and have to do a swept path analysis, which essentially drives the engine around the building and in all those spaces to make sure that the front of the engine doesn't cut off any kind of landscaping features or clip any kind of lamppost or anything like that, that it really actually can function based on the wheelbase around the space. When there are dead ends within the driving surface that are more than 150 feet, they require turnarounds, either a T or a lollipop, or some way to kind of move that apparatus around. And I'll say from experience, it's very difficult to back up a fire engine. Definitely in an emergency situation where there's multiple apparatus, it's much safer for everybody to have the engine be able to drive forward. The inner radii of turns has to be greater than 20 feet. And there's clearance required above and around the apparatus because typically they are taller than most regular cars. So making sure that any kind of bridges or walkways or even large trees on existing properties need to be maintained so that there is the clearance to get fire department apparatus through that space. The apparatus has to be able to drive on whatever surface is designated as access. There are grass paver options that do support the weight of an apparatus, but we've found that that doesn't necessarily work all the time because of New England. We do have winter and mud, and the ground is always kind of mushy in those times of year. So the apparatus access ways have to be maintained, so that has to be plowed during the winter. So it's much easier for the lifetime of the building to have actual hard surfaces, but they do make the permeable, drivable surfaces that are much more permanent, that can meet some of the environmental concerns, but also can still be plowed successfully. Another thing to consider is where does the snow go? And that's just with any kind of building, with any kind of parking lot. Push the snow to one end, then you lose some spaces. So a lot of plans that come in now designate where the snow is going to be stored. At the end of the day, the HJ can waive the requirements or certain aspects of the requirements for fire department access if they're not feasible. And that certainly is a conversation to have with the local fire department. This came up in a project that I had in Gloucester, where the roads in Gloucester are based off of cart roads from way back in the day. They're very small anyways to get an apparatus to the site itself. And then maneuvering around the site was just not possible. And it really wasn't feasible based on the fact that you can't even get a ladder truck down the road anyways. It doesn't make sense to try to get the site to accommodate a ladder truck. It's just never going to happen. So the AHA in that case waived certain portions of the requirement and accepted alternatives to provide a similar level of life safety. Chapter 20 is occupancy fire safety. Probably the most important one to think about as designers are paper materials in schools. And I don't like going into my daughter's school because they don't comply most of the time. Usually in the beginning of the year, it looks pretty good and people have everything kind of organized on the walls. But towards the end of the year, it's just, there's more artwork and everything just kind of spreads out. So as designers, you can really help this by providing artwork display areas and display cases. So there are requirements in this part of the fire code that lay out exactly how big those spaces can be, how they're distributed down the hallways, what it looks like in a classroom. Essentially, you don't want to have a lot of paper in egress hallways because a fire can spread along the wall much faster around paper, especially if it's in a vertical orientation. And most of those hallways, typically we have a higher class of finish for the interior finishes to provide less fire spread. So putting paper on the walls kind of defeats the whole purpose of Chapter 8 of the building code. So there are some allowances, and a lot of them are attached to bulletin boards is a good way to meet those requirements, especially if it's a designated area. Chapter 26 is it's not really new. We've had it in the fire code for a while, but it's going to get a lot of attention with the 10th edition. Essentially, what the FPR did is they put together a task group to look at laboratories using chemicals and the requirements within that chapter, and submitted it to the building code so that there's building code language about labs that use chemicals. Massachusetts is kind of a hub for lab space. We have a lot of biotech areas in Metro Boston that buildings are growing, and there's a lot of industry spaces being used for bench scale laboratories, which are not necessarily incredibly hazardous, but there are a lot of containers of flammable materials spread out throughout the building, and usually it's on a small scale, but a lot of a small amount ends up being a lot. So it is regulated through the fire code, and hopefully if that section is adopted through the 10th edition, it's in the building code and it should be easier to follow on how a building is laid out to comply with this section. Basically, there's different classifications for laboratories, A being the most hazardous and D being the least hazardous. It talks about the type of chemicals being used and how they're stored. This differs from use group H hazardous material spaces because you don't have large containers of flammable materials. You typically have smaller bench scale size containers in the lab itself, and then the backstock of chemical is in a different area. So it allows you a lot more leeway with the design of the spaces and in the height of the building. Chapter 28 is brand new to Massachusetts. We actually just had a major boatyard fire in Mattapoisett, I think in the fall. So we'd already been kind of talking about this because we do have a lot of coastline. So there are a lot of boatyards and boat storage in those coastal communities. and even inland. We have some really nice rivers. So boat storage is, as you can see, very condensed, and it can be really hazardous because you can't get water around the boat itself. So there are some regulations in the fire code about that. A lot of it has to do about access, getting an apparatus in and around a boatyard. So there has to be pathways to be able to get the fire truck to the seat of the fire to be able to have successful operations. Chapter 29 is parking garages. This is also a new chapter to Massachusetts. Most of the parking garage requirements are in the building code because it's a structure. But what we have in the fire code is the maintenance of parking garages. We did pull some requirements into the building code due to exterior coverings. There's a lot of textile coverings on the outside of parking garages for advertisement space or to kind of cut down the wind. But if you cut down the wind, you're also cutting down the free movement of air. So if something is added to a building after it's been approved as an open parking garage, it needs to be evaluated to make sure that it still meets the requirements of an open parking garage in terms of air movement, or you have to add some kind of ventilation system. There is a reference to the elevator code for mechanical access parking. You can see in this picture here, there's 2 levels of mechanical access parking, which is essentially the limit of what the code has prescriptively. I think I just looked at a project that has 3 levels. So once we start going beyond that, you really need an engineering judgment as to how that works and how that's protected. There's also some provisions for the storage of hydrogen vehicles, which is not as fast moving as electric vehicles, but I think it's coming on the heels of electric vehicles. So with parking garages, you have unique hazard considerations, and we had a large loss fire in Worcester, and there was a large loss fire in London, and a couple more internationally. So it has been researched a lot more through NFPA and FM Global and companies like that. Specifically, car stackers create an increased hazard because you're taking your combustible load, which is a car, and a lot of the car parts are plastic. You have upholstery in the inside. A lot of the metals used in cars are flammable, and you're taking that and you're putting it up in the air. So now there's airflow all around it, so the fire doesn't have any kind of limited oxygen supply, and it's up high. And so the issue is it obstructs the sprinkler from reaching the car below, and firefighters walk into a building like this and try to figure out how to deal with that. Most of the time, to put out a car fire, you have to put a hose inside the car itself. So getting up to the 2nd level safely is incredibly difficult. So the prescriptive sprinkler requirement for 2-level car stackers is extra hazard group 2, which is a lot of water. So if the building is put in an area that doesn't have a very good water supply, that might trigger some requirements to upgrade the fire department water supply fire protection system in the building. And the 10th edition has requirements for fire department access, so walkways at the level of the highest car stacker, every certain amount of horizontal distance, stairways out of pits instead of ladders, so that it's a little bit safer to get out, access from the outside of the building, things like that. So it's definitely going to be something to consider. It's all in Chapter 4 of the building code where it talks about parking garages. Chapters 30 through 37 and 39, just something to be aware of. We have multiple chapters. A lot of them don't really apply to design considerations because they're outside, but just so you've seen it. There are requirements for motion picture and television production studios, sound stages, and approved production facilities, which is a doozy of a title. But it's just kind of a fun thing that we have in the fire code that There are a lot of movies being made in Massachusetts, and when any of those special effects are used on site, or there's temporary generators and power for a crew and video equipment, that's all regulated through the fire code because it's not permanent, it moves. So there are provisions for that, just in case you were curious. Chapter 38 is cannabis growing, processing, or extraction facilities. In the 10th edition, we are finally adopting the same language in the building code. So the language that's going to be in the fire code says exactly the same thing and is really just used for maintenance, now that it's going to be in the 10th edition for building design. But there are provisions for monitoring of specific gases used for growing, like CO2, and then the process of extracting the oil from the leaf uses LPG or alcohols that are flammable. And so any kind of facility that has cannabis typically has some level of extraction associated with it. And it might be just a bench scale kind of flammable liquid process with alcohols, but that is still a process, and it still needs a permit through the fire department because you're using hazardous materials in a way to produce something. Chapters 40 through 45 are a lot of the process chapters. We've got dust explosion, welding, and other hot work is definitely a construction requirement. Refueling is your self-serve gas stations, spraying, dipping, and coating using flammable combustible materials. A lot of spray booths that you might see in car repair shops or manufacturing facilities for aerosolating the particles of the flammable paint into the air, so it needs to be contained and protected in a specific way. There's also a new chapter to NFPA for solvent extraction, which is very similar to the cannabis section, but it applies to like other types of essential oils, lavender, mint, all those kinds of things that might use a solvent to extract something, has to follow a specific standard and be evaluated. And then combustible fibers. There is a brand new chapter to the NFPA code and also Massachusetts for additive manufacturing. And I will say, there is a facility in Massachusetts that does this at a very high scale. It's a really interesting process. They do biomechanical parts like hip replacements and things like that. We went in and took a look at it and said, you know, there's a lot of flammable metals are being used. A lot of times it's heated up to a point where it can cause a fire. And in this case, they were using lasers and melting the metal on top of what they were building. So it's very, very precise. And we said, okay, you know, this seems pretty hazardous. We should probably have an analysis on this building. And 2 weeks later, they had a fire. It was contained and the fire department responded, but it's not very often that we go into a building and look at something and then we're right, proven right almost immediately afterwards. So there's no fire department permit for the process itself, but a lot of the materials that are used are flammable solids. And the requirements kind of talk about the proper handling and processing of the materials that are being used. Chapters 47 through 51. Chapter 50 is commercial cooking requirements. Nothing new really changed there. You still need to have a commercial cooking hood suppression system over equipment of a certain size, basically a commercial size. There are some new requirements for food trucks, which is good because they do move around, and so having a statewide standard helps jurisdictions quickly approve a food truck within their jurisdiction. And then Chapter 51 is industrial ovens and furnaces. Chapter 52 is energy storage systems. So this is one of the ones that we specifically wanted to go into in this presentation. We adopt the 2020 NFPA 855, which is a brand new NFPA standard. And they're already publishing the 2023 version of the standard, which has some updates, but pretty much covers the same material. So if you have a commercial building, there's a fire department permit required for any energy storage system that has over 20 kilowatt hour capacity. And that depends on the chemistry. It's a little bit smaller if you have something brand new, a new technology. You definitely have to get a permit at 10 kilowatt hours. There's hazard mitigation analysis for ESS over 600 kilowatt hours. And essentially, because you have a very flammable material within these batteries, there needs to be an emergency operation plans. There's limitations of how dense the energy storage can be within a certain fire area. So a lot of times, if you're going to have it in a building, it needs to be split up between multiple rooms, or there has to be space between the units to kind of create a fire break. And then there's specific fire protection features. So depending on the chemistry of the ESS itself, maybe water's not the best way to protect it. There's some quick notification. I think we're going to see a lot of these put on rooftops to go with the solar provisions to meet some of the energy code provisions that are coming into the state and progressing in that direction. And so you need to have radiant heat detection on rooftop installations, which is essentially a flame detector. So the chapter does talk about indoor and outdoor installations. Right now, we're seeing mostly outdoor installations. You can have indoor installations, and it's probably best to have it in a dedicated building because there's a lot of requirements when it's incorporated into an otherwise occupied building. You need to have fire department access through all those solar fields to get to your energy storage system so that they can get there quickly and deal with whatever the fire is. Means of egress applies with the building code, but then there's some extra requirements like signage, impact protection. If you have a warehouse where ESS might be within the warehouse floor, making sure people don't drive into it with forklifts, there has to be some type of impact protection to protect the batteries. They do off-gas toxic gases when they're being charged. So just regular operations, there is a toxic and flammable gas that's given off of most of these batteries. So regular ventilation is required to kind of keep the air moving and not allow that flammable vapor to hit those limits where it's going to cause an issue. 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouse units, we had a memo that went out from DFS and CBRS June of 2021, and we were working on this code at the time, so we took most of those provisions from the memo, reviewed them in a very technical committee, and added some of them to the code where NFPA 855 did not have them. So it is very similar to NFPA 55's requirements for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouse units, energy storage systems, but there are a couple additional Massachusetts requirements that have to do with documentation and decommissioning and some of the things that just weren't addressed in 855. Permit is required for an energy storage system over 1 kilowatt hour in a house. So if there is one put in, then the fire department needs to know about it, and there's a permit required. So that's something that we knew was coming in the code. So basically, all energy storage systems that are installed in houses need to have a permit through the fire department. It's mostly just notification that it's happening, because if these are involved in a fire or if they're even adjacent to a fire, it's important for the fire department to know that so that they can mitigate that hazard and either try to remove it so that it is out of the building or stop the fire before it hits the garage or wherever these units are located. Chapters 53 through 59, most of them are deleted, but you have some equipment, mechanical refrigeration, and flammable gas piping systems. Chapter 60 is hazardous materials. This is where you find all of your general requirements. We updated our maximum allowable quantity table to be the same that you find in Chapter 3 of the building code, but this has storage and use locations. A big one that's specific to Massachusetts is if there's a process or processing using hazardous materials, pretty much anything. If it's mixed, heated, cooled, really any kind of physical process, then you need to have a permit through the fire department mostly notification, but if it's on a large manufacturing scale, then there's federal requirements that come into play and a little bit more analysis. It's a scaled approach. Small bench scale things need just a small report, and then larger installations need a much larger report and analysis in multiple levels. There are some things that aren't required in Chapter 60, and it kind of lays that out. I did talk about material process and processing. So if you start having labs, just know that this is a requirement and that the fire department needs to be brought in so they're aware of what the hazards are and what to do. A lot of labs will use corrosive materials, and they have high concentrated materials, and that doesn't necessarily trigger this requirement, but it's always good to have a conversation with the fire department so that they're not left walking into a building not knowing what's in there. Chapter 61 through 64, like I said, it gets into all of the different hazardous materials sections. So depending on what you have, aerosols, compressed gases, that applies to nitrogen and hydrogen. So a lot of lab use buildings will use some type of compressed gas. So there's requirements in there. And then the fireworks chapter is 65. And then you have all of your different hazardous materials chapters all the way through. So similar to alternative means and methods that you have in the building code, there's a section about compliance alternatives. The provisions of the code don't prohibit the use of equivalencies, but if you're going to provide an alternative to the code, it needs to be well documented on why that's needed and how it's meeting the intent of the code in terms of fire and life safety. And in these cases, the local AHJ can approve it, or they can deny it and send it to the Fire Prevention Appeals Board. So very similar language to how the building code is set up, and a very similar process. There's 3 voting members, I believe. Sometimes there might be more that attend, but typically there are 3 members of the Board of Fire Prevention Regulations are selected to hear the hearing. It's an informal hearing similar to the BBRS process, where you submit an application with your submitted your documentation and your support in advance so that the board can read it. And then the hearing itself is them asking some questions. Why is this here? How do you think that you meet the code? What is your hardship? And then after hearing everything, the board will render a decision. So on some of the hazardous material stuff, it might go to the Fire Prevention Appeals Board because the local fire department might not have the expertise to render a decision, but the state Board of Fire Prevention Regulations has representatives from different parts of industry that could really weigh in on that. So this is the questions point slide. My email is up there. And then also I wanted to point out our Code Insights page on Code Red's website. It's coderedconsultants.com/insights. And we do post weekly updates to the codes, whether it's the electrical code, building code, fire code. So if you have any kind of questions, kind of frequently asked questions, we try to handle it on our website, but feel free to take a look at that if you're ever looking for something. So I see if there's some people wanting to chat.
Thanks, Jen. If anyone has questions, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. I know we have one in the chat that I'll start with, which is, what is the overlap between Chapter 60 of the Fire Code and NFPA 30?
Okay, good question. There is some overlap. Chapter 60 kind of handles just general requirements for all types of hazardous materials, and when it's a flammable and combustible liquid, which is what NFPA 30 handles, it sends it to Chapter 66, and Chapter 66 is mostly extracts from NFPA 30. So a lot of the requirements in NFPA 30 that deal with how materials are transferred through a building, how it's used, some of the more specific requirements like the density of sprinklers in certain areas, that's in NFPA 30, specific to the hazard, and that's referenced by the fire code. It's also kind of referenced by the building code when you get into some of the like 414, 415 kind of parts of the special use and occupancy. So eventually it all ends up in the same place. But because hazardous materials are hazardous because of fire, it does fall under the fire code for the fire official to have some level of insight and communication with the design team.
Okay. Are there other questions? I think that was the only question I saw in the chat. It's a quiet group this morning.
I have a question, Josh and Jen. This is Terica. So one thing that we're seeing a lot of in a lot of our projects right now is bike storage. And with the rise of e-bikes and e-scooters, I'm just kind of curious what you're seeing or hearing. It doesn't seem like we've got any maybe direct specific guidance on this, but can you talk to that some?
Sure. Yeah, the problem is that there's not a lot of direct guidance or information from NFPA even, and we've been looking into it at Code Red just because we have the same types of questions, and they come up a lot with lead buildings where there's bike storage now, pretty much required, but everybody has e-bikes. So the batteries themselves do contain hazardous materials, so depending on how many spots you have or what you might have in the future, potentially that room could be more hazardous than the rest of the building, and it might require a higher sprinkler density from the heads that are protecting it, usually like an extra hazard. And if you're going to separate an extra hazard sprinkler density space from the rest of the building, you have to provide rated walls so that the sprinklers can handle up to 60 or 90 minutes, so your walls are 60 or 90 minutes to kind of limit that space. So a lot of times, if there's bike storage in a building, we typically recommend that it meets the criteria for like a control area or just the hazardous separation based on the sprinklers itself. Hopefully there'll be more guidance. Our experience with energy storage systems and batteries in general is that the bigger they are, typically the safer they are. So like Teslas undergo a lot of testing on their cars, and their batteries are relatively big. Same thing with energy storage systems. You have large batteries, large companies, a lot of money behind that to provide the testing. When you get down to smaller things like e-bikes or hoverboards, they're smaller. You have a lot of manufacturers in the market. They don't necessarily always test. And so the quality of the battery construction itself can be less. So the issue you have with e-bikes, and we've had a lot of fires with hoverboards and cell phones and stuff like that, is that the battery is compartmentalized. And if there's little pieces of metal or impurities inside the battery, those can perforate the separation between the battery. And when that happens, the chemicals mix and it goes into thermal runaway. So the bigger the batteries, the more control is put on their manufacturing. With e-bikes and hoverboards and things like that, there's not as much control, so you end up seeing more fires. So they are more hazardous. But yeah, I think that's something that has been asked of NFPA and of the industry a lot, and NFPA is a bit slow in providing an answer to that. But my advice would be to follow the sprinkler criteria and provide a rated separation around it on all 6 sides to kind of compartmentalize that bike storage room, because whether people have e-bikes now, they will in the future. It's so much easier to ride an e-bike than it is of a normal bike. So I think that a lot of bike commuters going into offices or public buildings are going to start using them a lot more frequently, So it's good to kind of design with that in mind. I know that's a very gray answer, but we have to keep our ear to the ground and see if there's any specific concrete advice coming out of NFPA or any of the other organizations.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'm going to add a bit to that just because I sit on a couple committees with the Society of Fire Protection Engineers with this, and the industry is very interested in it also because there have been some fairly well documented fires. I mean, Jen hit most of the issues with it. We're seeing a lot of problems with unregulated batteries, which right now there really are no regulations. There are no listing requirements for it. I know UL and other listing agencies are trying to get them done, and they're doing a lot of testing in response to that and developing a standard that they can create a listing from. But it's going to take a little bit of time for that to actually get into the code bodies, just because, you know, most of the time we're looking at 3-year increments of code adoption. With that said, because the fire protection industry is looking at this fairly closely, we're capturing a lot of data in a short amount of time. While this might not be picked up by building and fire codes, and therefore it's not technically regulated, it's good to have that analysis done and to take some precautions. Charging seems to be the biggest issue. And there are some jurisdictions that are setting their own regulations. I know New York City is kind of working their way towards it just because the fire department has seen so many like weekly e-bike fires. And the problem that they're having is you can't really put the fires out. The thermal runaway is something that you can dump water on it to cool it, which is great. But at the end of the day, they actually have a method and process in place with the fire department there where they have tubs that they bring along, and there's a special liquid that they put the bikes in that helps to shield the fire. Again, you really can't stop it until it's burned itself out. So especially in some of the bigger cities like New York and others that are seeing this happen, I think we'll start seeing regulations come out outside of the code adoption process just because they can't wait. But other than that, you know, it's going to get there, and some of the research is being done. Some of the research is already done. I know SFP through the SFP Foundation is working on it right now. We're trying to get some white papers out into the industry as well and out to everybody to just identify the hazards and some mitigating aspects for it. But it's going to take a design team that's willing to do something that's probably above and beyond the code, just recognizing the hazard to really address it.
Thank you.
John, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just curious, picking up on that, and you kind of made the point, Josh. Right now, the as it relates to these type of fires, the idea is just dump a ton of water on it and put it in a tub eventually. But what I'm wondering is, are we moving towards, just as an example, I don't think this would work, but you know, like in the kitchen system, we have a halide system, which is a chemical system. Are we moving towards the idea of not using a water type of sprinkler for these type of installations and moving to something else like a halide or, you know, whatever else will work on batteries? Do we think that will end up becoming the norm for these type of spaces?
Maybe. I think the battery technology is moving forward pretty fast. And so the types of batteries that are being developed now are much better in terms of fire safety. So water might be okay for those. The issue with clean agents is that they're finite. So they only work in a certain concentration. And once they're put into a space or a room, the room and space has finite walls and it needs to be contained, and it only, you know, is supposed to work for 10 minutes, or there's a certain time criteria there. And so it inerts the chemical reaction of fire by replacing parts within that chemical equation. Once that's gone, you still have the heat and you still have the chemicals interacting, so then it can go into thermal runaway. The thing with water is that it cools down the surrounding area and tries to keep whatever's not involved from being hot enough to go into thermal runaway. There's a lot of issues with batteries and how you actually get your fire protection agent, whether it's water or something else, to the seat of the fire. A lot of times they're shielded. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, industry is wide open. I've seen some things, a company that's trying to develop a extinguishing agent that goes within the panel itself, within the battery cabinet or within an electrical cabinet, that essentially pops open if it's hot enough and then releases some type of agent within the panel itself, and that should like inert the fire quickly. But you know, it's hard to say where we're going to go with this. I think that when you have, it varies so much. The hazard is used in all different types of applications, so it's hard to kind of say what it'll be. I know that a lot of outdoor installations for ESS within those containers are typically tested with water suppression within its UL 9548 testing. So they haven't really done a whole lot of like research to get approved with clean agents. I think that's definitely coming because it would be a much better solution. A lot of solar farms are in the middle of nowhere and there's no water supply, so it makes it really difficult for firefighters to show up and bring their own water. So yeah, I think there certainly are applications for clean agents, but because of the constraints of how the system works, it's really hard to make it prescriptive for everything.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll tag on again. You know, for the larger energy storage systems, the big battery arrays and things that we're starting to see, it looks like some of the manufacturers are getting behind specific solutions for its own enclosure and some additional requirements for compartmentation, active suppression, other things. So some of the hazards related to e-bikes and other things, I mean, these are localized hazards for the area, and I think I don't think we're going to see many regulations for getting away from sprinkler systems to specifically saying you must have a clean agent system or some other inerting gas or something like that, just because of the requirements for those systems. I mean, Jen nailed it. It's, you know, they are finite. Once the gas is discharged, it's there for 10 minutes. And if that fire is not out after 10 minutes, and these batteries typically aren't once they're in thermal runaway, you're basically relying back on a sprinkler system to then cool off the surrounding area again anyway. There are also some enclosure requirements because you have to maintain a concentration for those types of systems in the room. So you have to be able to provide a fairly enclosed space, you know, dampered areas and things to keep that concentration in place for the time to let it do its work. I think we're going to run into some compartmentation requirements coming up to kind of contain the space. As Jen said, I think the sprinkler systems are probably going to be the same way. We do this with other hazards that we can't completely extinguish, you know, large outdoor fuel sources and things like that. We spray them with water and keep them cooled so that they're contained to the fire location and don't let it go beyond that. But trying to actually extinguish these fires is proving to be very difficult. And until we start getting some regulations on the batteries and things like that, I don't know that you're going to see a lot of changes to suppression systems, just because it's still kind of the Wild West with regards to how this battery technology is developed, tested, and put on the market.
Thank you.
There is another question in the, oh, I'm sorry. Yep, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so there's a question about escape rooms.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There is a portion of Chapter 4 that talks in the building code that's special use and occupancies, and it does kind of talk about special amusement spaces. So kind of has some stuff in there that could be applied to escape rooms. I think escape rooms typically are a smaller scale than that. But there was a provision in the 2021 IBC that said puzzle rooms need to have means of egress, and there were 3 options. BBRS decided to delete those options and say the egress has to comply with Chapter 10. So you still have to have free means of egress. You can't really, like, I've seen people get handcuffed to the wall and they have to find a key, and you can't do that. You have to be able to escape. And there have been some pretty serious fatal fires internationally in escape rooms that are really tragic. So definitely Massachusetts has kind of taken the tact of they're just like any other room, any other place of assembly. You do need to have obvious means of egress that aren't hidden. So a lot of times the door you come in might have an exit sign over it and you're told not to exit that door, go find a new door. And that's kind of how it's handled, but it has to be visible and obvious, and you have to have if it's required to have your fire alarm system, has to be obvious, and it can't just be completely hidden. You have to have your fire and life safety features of the space included like you would with any other type of assembly occupancy or public space. But they do call them puzzle rooms in the IBC. So if you're looking up stuff, you can kind of look in the annex there and see if there's any more information about it, but that's the terminology if you're doing a search.
There is another chat question that says, could you talk about requirements regarding elevator shafts and lobbies? It's fairly broad.
Yeah, that's a bit more of a building code requirement than a fire code requirement. Yeah, some of that changed a little bit in the building code. There are provisions for lobbies. Elevator shafts need to be protected when you're going up multiple levels. Typically, you have an elevator when you're going up like 3, so you typically need to have 2-hour rating. If you have a high-rise building, you have to pressurize your elevator shafts, but we're finding in a lot of lab buildings or buildings that have a lot of different types of ventilation, pressurizing elevator shafts doesn't really work because it's very hard to balance the building and make sure that you hit those marks for the pressurization in and out of the elevator. So a lot of times lobbies will be added to those spaces. There is a provision in the 10th edition that allows you to have one of your means of egress through an elevator lobby to get to a stair, which I think is a new provision. But yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to look at it as it specifically applies to your building and what you're trying to do. And I think there's something about the first floor and whether you need to have a lobby or not. I think you can.
Yeah, you're allowed to omit the lobby on the level of exit discharge, I think is what the code says for that. So you don't have to have it there. Yeah, be careful of the elevator pressurization. It's a tricky, it sounds like a great system so that you don't have to have elevator lobbies. It's a bit trickier to design and commission than you might think.
And I think the code specifically calls out smoke guard, not to be like proprietary, but those I forget they're called, if they're called like shaft curtains or fire curtains or something like that, but the roll down shutter that comes in front of the elevator, and because you can always have a door on your elevator hoistway, and I've only ever seen them in like really old hotels, but you can close out your elevator shaft as a shaft, and there are provisions on essentially smoke guard systems and how those are tested, because it's not tested to the wall standard, and the issue was that the wall standard required a hose test, and when you fire a water hose at a curtain, it moves. So there's specific requirements now that you meet all the flame spread criteria, but you don't have the hose aspect on the end of it. So now it's a specifically prescriptive allowed alternative. Whereas I think a lot of times you typically needed to go to the building official and get like a compliance alternative approved, and it usually is fairly easy to do, but now you don't even have to do that in the 10th edition.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so we're going to end about 15 minutes early. Jen, thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise today. We appreciate you being here. Thanks everyone for participating. This is being recorded, so if you want to go back and take a look at it later, it will be available at some point on the BSA site as well. And we will see you at the next meeting. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.